So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Mosse-Lecture today, a next and important step in our program, coup d'etat, between military coups and constitutional captures. 2 weeks ago, the legal scholar Anna Bettina Kaiser, in our first Mosse-Lecture this semester, presented her considerations not only on how every constitution can be transformed in a dictatorship, but also how it becomes clear that there is no single script for the gradual destruction of democracy, and that, in fact, we are witnessing a variety of different forms of constitutional dismantling. On January 22nd next year, Kim Lane-Shepele from Princeton University will follow this line by talking about counter-constitution in the present US-American regime. These constitutional dramas have become frighteningly close to us and, if you will, have become subject to our legal experience. But perhaps that is precisely a good reason to remember what we do not know, what usually happens on the margins of European Western perspective and challenges us in our own ignorance. This introduction must therefore begin with an admission. Recent studies leave little doubt that large parts of the African continent are still blank spots in the political map in our Western eyes. The amount of broadcasting time and print space devoted by renowned news media to African countries and population is estimated at around 3%. The share of the global south is around 10%, with both figures showing a downward trend in recent years. In addition, the topics covered are almost exclusively determined by crises and catastrophes, supplemented by what is perceived here as an affliction by migration. This applies in particular to the countries of West Africa and the Sahel region, namely Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, which will be a prominent example for the topic of today's Mosse-Lecture. We probably have only a shadowy memory of the events that led to the nervous withdrawal of German troops from Mali, from their camp in Mali, France's retreat from the region, and the advance of Russia and the Wagner Group in 2023. Let me thus provide a brief background information. Emerging from the colony of French West Africa, these countries, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, these countries underwent a remarkable alternation between one-party regimes, democratic governments, and several military coups after gaining independence in 1960. Since 2011, the states of the Sahel region have also been affected by jihadist uprisings. These culminated in the Mali war between the European-backed government and the Tuareg independence movement, and in the Boko Haram attacks in Niger. Against the backdrop of disastrous security situation, new military coups took place in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger between 2021 and 2023, deposing the elected pro-French governments. Coups reminiscent of a series coups in Africa, such as in Benin, Guinea, and Guinea-Bissau. The three Sahel states were subsequently suspended by the France-oriented Economic Community of West African States, the so-called ECOWAS, an organization that threatened military intervention after the recent coup in Niger. The military governments in Mali and Burkina Faso pledged their support to Niger, a move that led to the establishment of the Alliance of Sahel States, the ASS, and the three countries' withdrawal from the Economic Community of West African States, and also the International Organization of Francophone Countries in early 2025. The declared goals of the new confederation is now to build joint armed forces, to create an economic and monetary union with long-term goal of establishing a federal state. The latest sparse news from November 2025 indicates that Mali's infrastructure has been largely crippled by attacks from Al-Qaeda militias, and that support for the junta among the population has dwindled. The German government, by the way, recently advised its citizens to leave the country. So against this backdrop, let me ask some preliminary questions. Could it be imaginable that this transition from colonial rule to a veritable maze of freedom movements, dictatorships, various military coups, democratic regimes, pro-European governments, culminating in the most recent coup d'etat, still corresponds to the dialectic of violence that Frantz Fanon claimed for the processes of decolonization in his 1961 book, The Wretched of the Earth, Die Verdammten der Erde. Could it be that violence, as an unavoidable means of emancipation, must be directed not only against colonial rule, but also against the local bourgeoisie and heirs of the old powers? And that the coup d'etat is another necessary step towards decolonization, and possibly not the last? And that a certain indistinction between revolution, military putsch, and coup d'etat has emerged here? And finally, should we broaden our concept of coup d'etat, and do we touch here the outer limits of Western political thinking? However, I don't want to anticipate such questions and possible answers, but rather leave the floor to our guest today. I'm very pleased to introduce Mouhamadou El Hady Ba. Mouhamadou El Hady Ba is a philosopher, cognitive scientist, and associate professor of philosophy at Université Cheikh Anta Diop in Dakar. His areas of expertise include logic, epistemology, philosophy of science, and political philosophy. And the prominent, for me, most interesting focus is on his his works concerns the options and problems of decolonizing political theory. Hady Ba has worked as a visiting scholar at the Università di Torino, the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris, and most recently as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Connecticut and the Institute for African Studies at Columbia University. He's also a founding member and first scientific director of the independent and Pan-African think tank IPOD. In his role, Hady Ba has worked on terrorism in the Sahel region and on political issues primarily concerning West Africa. We are very glad that Hady Ba accepted our invitation. The topic of his lecture is Decolonial Coup d'etat, with a question mark, please welcome our guest, Mouhamadou El Hady Ba. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Professor, for this very generous introduction. First and foremost, I'd like to tell how grateful I am to be invited to give these Mosse-Lectures. Thank you to all those who proposed my name and all those who made the conference possible. In the dark times we are in, I deeply appreciate the significance of inviting a Black African Muslim to give a talk in a series set up to honor the legacy of a trailblazing Jewish intellectual who devoted his life to defending freedom and dignity for all human beings. And given that, coincidentally, we are currently in the Festival of Lights, let me wish all those who celebrate a happy Hanukkah. An interpretation of what is currently happening in West Africa, and more specifically in the Sahel region, is that we are witnessing the completion of the decolonial project that has been interrupted and derailed by the maneuver of the Françafrique. The coup d'etat that gave rise to the Alliance of Sahel States would therefore be a Hegelian trick of history to break free from colonialism that keeps African in a world system essentially antithetical to the needs of its population. This interpretation is reinforced by the observations that while for Fanon decolonization is essentially a violent process, the decolonizations of the 60s took place relatively smoothly. Smoothly, that is, in a way that maintains the privileges of a transnational ruling class. In this lecture, I will show that the decolonial claims of the supporters of these coups are fallacious. To do so, I will draw on 3 points. First, the cause of historical events in these countries argues more for a diversion of the population's legitimate anger than for a genuine anti-colonial revolution. Second, I will engage in a philosophical reflection on the nature of power and authority to argue that the regimes that emerge from these coups are, on balance, more illegitimate than the regimes they replaced. Finally, I will draw on 2 revolutionary pre-colonial moments, 3 actually: the founding of the Mali Empire, the Fouta Revolution led by Thierno Souleymane Baal, and from the removal from power of Daou Demba Houredia Kouli Fall, the 6th Damel of Cayor, to support the illegitimacy, even in light of the endogenous political tradition of the junta of the AS countries, using work I did with Gregory Dukas, who currently is in Dakar from the US, actually. I will conclude that deeply rooted decolonial politics should have the same components that are evident in the Hunter's Oath and the Fouta Revolution. First, a collective endeavor to change reality. Second, an emphasis on education. 3, the promotion of responsibility, not only at the collective level, but also at the personal level. Saving Private Talent is the title of this part. On November 26, 2025, at the very end of the electoral process, when only the result remained to be announced, the President of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau called the national and international press to declare himself the victim of a coup d'etat. Despite widespread disbelief, Senegal exfiltrated him, and high-ranking officers of the army declared themselves the new authorities of Guinea-Bissau. halting the electoral process and targeting politicians who had not had time to flee and who appeared to want to protest the power grab. 2 days after this successful coup, Gambia and Senegal announced the arrest of Lieutenant Colonel Sana Manja. He was the head of the Junglers, the infamous death squad of the former and erratic Gambian dictator Yahya Jammeh. At the time of his arrest, rumors circulated that he was plotting a coup d'etat in favor of his former mentor, who had left Malabo, where he had been living in exile since his fall from power, to join the Gambia. Whether this rumor was true or not, it fits within a context that lends it credence. Indeed, a few days later, on December 7, 2025, soldiers appeared on Beninese national television and announced they had seized power. This coup lasted only a few hours, after which loyalists within the Beninese government, army, regained control and drove out the leaders of this farce. Before the successful coup in Guinea-Bissau, there had been another one in Madagascar, where the army, after refusing to repress demonstrators, turned against the one giving the orders and decided to seize power for itself. Before Madagascar, there was Gabon, Niger, Sudan, Burkina Faso, Sudan again, Guinea-Conakry, Mali, and so on. In fact, between August 2020 and December 2025, there were 14 coups d'etat in Africa. Remarkably, 78% of the 27 coups that took place in Africa between 1990 and 2023 occurred in the former French colonies. Of course, we are all too quick to blame France for all of Africa's ills. But perhaps we are not wrong. This correlation, while not necessarily causal, is still quite telling, isn't it? Whether one listens to terrorists, the perpetrator of this coup, or even some Western journalists, France is often singled out without reservation. Let's return to the attempted coup in Benin. When on December 7, the mutineers declared themselves masters of Cotonou, one of the first people to react was the Franco-Beninese activist and presidential candidate for the April 2026 elections, Kemi Seba. After creating a black supremacist and anti-Semitic movement, the Tribuca, in his native France, Seba gradually evolved towards an anti-French and pro-Russian Pan-Africanism and lived for years in Senegal before being expelled. Very close to Russia, Kemi Seba saw the coup in Benin as a liberation from the yoke of Patrick Talon, supposedly close to France and Western powers. According to people like Seba, had the coup succeeded, it would have been a decolonial moment marking the effective end of French control over Benin and a further step in the decolonization of Africa. At first, the victory of the Beninese loyalist troops seemed to be a victory of democracy over the return of authoritarianism. Very quickly, however, it became apparent that this victory was not entirely homegrown. First, it was discovered that the Nigerian army had bombed some of the mutineers' positions. Then it was revealed, ultimate proof of colonialism, that France itself had intervened to guide the loyalists' return to power. This involvement of Nigeria and France reinforces the argument used to justify coups in West Africa, that this region of the world is at best a neo-colony and at worst still a French colony. Regional institutions like ECOWAS, in whose name Nigeria intervened, are considered scarcely better than France and are in any case in the pay of either France or the Western powers. perceived as a malevolent totalitarian entity. The legitimacy of the coups is supposedly based on the need to fight against this control. It can certainly be argued that it is doubtful that ECOWAS, which includes both Anglophone and Francophone states, is under French control. However, according to critics of West African democracy's shortcomings, there is an objective alliance between ECOWAS and France, in that both support the maintaining Africa's subordinate position within a capitalist and imperialist order. Why would African leaders submit to an order that is contrary to their country's interest? Because African leaders are not patriots but puppets who are ready to collaborate with foreign powers to maintain their hold on their country. Fanon had already seen that the greatest risk facing former colonies would be an alliance between the national bourgeoisie and the former colonizer. The alliance is natural because, as Fanon points out, in the wretch of the earth, within this, and I quote, "Within this national bourgeoisie, one finds neither industrialist nor financier. The national bourgeoisie of underdeveloped countries is not oriented towards production, invention or construction, or labor. It is entirely channeled towards intermediary activities. Being in the loop, involved in the scheme, seems to be its deepest calling. The national bourgeoisie has a psychology of businessmen, not captain of industries." Incapable of creating this national bourgeoisie, end of quote, incapable of creating this national bourgeoisie is depending on maintaining the colonial system, which allows it to retain its position as an intermediary between the formerly colonized and the colonizers. This perpetuation of the economic system, cultural alienation, and the colonizer's language solidifies its status and allows the national bourgeoisie to continue what Fanon calls its schemes. In this instance, ECOWAS has a particularly bad reputation in Pan-Africanist and evolutionary circles. It is criticized not only for being part of the capitalist and imperialist economic order, but, above all, for having double standards when it comes to defending the rule of law, even among figures holding prominent positions, such as the current Prime Minister of Senegal. These criticisms are widespread. A label that sticks to this institution is that of trade union for heads of states. The thesis is that ECOWAS' sole concern is to defend the interests of those who contingently are at the head of member states rather than serve those states. ECOWAS is also criticized for its extreme tolerance of constitutional manipulations that allow heads of states elected for a limited number of terms to circumvent this democratic safeguard and extend their mandates. The Senegalese political scientist Yorodia coined the concept of Sisyphean democracy to describe these supposedly democratic African political entities where the rules of the game and the framework are constantly renegotiated according to the balance of power between parties involved. The state being, according to Weber's famous definition, an institutional enterprise of a political nature which successfully claims for the implementation of its order a monopoly on coercion, allows those heads of state to easily pass laws that suit them through coercion or corruption. The viewpoint of ECOWAS critics is therefore that this organization accepts without question actions that amount to coup d'etat. Constitutional coups, certainly, because these coups are perpetrated by members of their own club, instead of but vehemently condemn military coups carried out by individuals outside their circle. ECOWAS' position on coup d'etat is thus considered purely selfish and likely to promote the oppression of African people, provided it cloaks itself in the trappings of legality. Such criticism legitimizes military coups, which are the only way for African people to get rid of oppressors in suits who are cloaked in the mantle of legality. Patrice Talon, the president of Benin, who narrowly escaped a last-minute coup, is both the perfect caricature and the perfect counterexample to this argument. Certainly, Mr. Talon was democratically elected and re-elected. However, he is a wealthy businessman, a member of a family whose ties to European business circles go back centuries, including to the slave trade to America. Furthermore, before his election, Patrice Talon had taken refuge in France, accused of plotting to assassinate his former friend, who was also the then president of Benin, Yayi Boni. Finally, when it came to saving Private Talon, France and ECOWAS mobilized without delay to thwart what Kemi Seba had already touted as the day of Benin's liberation. All of this is not inaccurate. However, after his 2 terms, Mr. Talon wisely refrained from manipulating the constitution to run again. While he did designate a successor, he is also organizing elections of which there is no reason to believe they won't reflect the will of the Beninese people. Furthermore, Patrice Talon is recognized for having presided over a period of economic prosperity for his country, and for strengthening institutions by establishing a Senate where all former presidents, including his former rival, Yayi Boni, will sit. The situation in Benin could therefore be more complex than we think. Is the same true in other cases in West Africa? The most remarkable case, and the one inspiring the most hope among the revolutionaries, leftist, and anti-globalization activists, is that of the 3 countries that make up the Alliance of Sahel States. Faced with governments deemed tyrannical or illegitimate, military officers from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger seized power in their respective countries. These military officers were not content with simply seizing power and legitimizing elections that would allow them to take their seats in ECOWAS trade union for heads of states. Faced with the condemnation of their respective coups by sub-regional organizations, the Malian, Burkinabe, and Nigerian juntas adopted a strategy of rupture, denouncing agreement with France and the Western Bloc and breaking with ECOWAS. Even more significantly, these 3 states created an independent bloc which they named the Alliance of the Sahel States, and which were formalized by the Liptako-Gourma Charter. Adopting a resolutely anti-ECOWAS, anti-French, and anti-Western stance, and regularly nationalizing raw materials, the Alliance of Sahel States seems to offer an alternative and genuinely decolonial vision of what an African alliance should be, one that excludes all foreign interference and is committed to laying the foundation of true decolonization of the continent. It is therefore both normal and predictable that the African bourgeoisie, represented by the ruling technocracy, does not approve of it. Certainly, ASS sometimes commits abuse and human rights violations, but overall, even the most fervent defenders of African dignity turn a blind eye to these abuses, attributing them to revolutionary fervor. We will cite here 2 important figures from the Pan-African milieu to show how and why alter-globalist and anti-capitalist intellectuals support the confiscation of power by these juntas. Let's begin with Mrs. Aminata Draman Traoré. a doctor of psychology, former professor at the University of Abidjan, and former minister of the Republic of Mali. Living in Bamako, she is at the heart of the action. A leading figure in anti-capitalist and alter-globalization circles, she has always fought for the dignity of African people oppressed by the global system as it currently operates. Mrs. Traoré is, for example, a fervent activist against the CFA franc, which is accused of being the primary instrument used by the Banque de France to exploit African economies. According to Mrs. Traoré, the Malian junta, and by extension the states of the Alliance of Sahel States, is engaged in a distinctly decolonial process of disengagement from the global system that governs the world economy. To ignore this geopolitical context of extractivism, Traoré argues, is to prevent oneself from seeing that the ASS's seizure of power is merely the logical, even inevitable consequence of ECOWAS's failure. The ASS, in her words, represents a significant and decisive turning point, end of quote, that will allow for an escape from, and I cite her, economic, monetary, food, health, environmental, and emotional insecurities, end of quote, provided that the violence of the capitalist system is, I quote, named, and that the people are placed at the center of the governing body's concern. According to Traoré, the ASS is the first African organization whose primary economic concern is to promote a dignity economy that puts African resources at the service of the majority of the African population. While it is true that the ASS is not democratic, Mrs. Traoré believes that you should accept that dignity takes precedence over freedom, and that the African masses must first and foremost escape poverty. We will return later to the question of whether the ASS provides better than ECOWAS a decoupling from the world system. But for now, let us focus on another activist thinker, Hamzat Boukari Yabara, a Franco-Beninese scholar with a doctorate in history from the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales and a specialist in Pan-Africanism. Boukari Yabara also believes that France is at the heart of the West African problem. He argues that France, through its rhetoric of aid, has trapped its former colonies in what he calls a narrative of poverty. According to him, France's supposed aid has not lifted any of its beneficiaries out of misery in over 60 years. In the same conference, Boukari Yabara theorizes two types of coup d'etat: coup of rupture and coup of revitalizations. The second category refers to coup approved by Françafrique, France's neocolonial influence in Africa, and whose objective is to allow a system on its last leg in a state of advanced delegitimization to relaunch itself by maintaining neo-colonial structures while changing the local actors. One might think here of the coup d'etat in Gabon and Chad, for example. The radical novelty brought about by the juntas that make up the ASS, according to him, is that they carried out coup d'etat of rupture. He states that these coups, and I quote, "These are coups d'etat of rupture because they aim to change the direction and nature of relations on an international scale by emancipating themselves from the former colonial power," end of quote. Taking a more academic than political stance, Zimbabwean academic Blessing Simora observes that the initial actions of the military leadership of the ASS states were resolutely decolonial, ranging from undermining the importance of the language of the former colonizer to militarization and the establishment of an economic system focused on the need of the people. In the rest of my remarks, I would like to answer three questions to see whether the idea that the coup d'etats in West Africa, particularly in the ASS states, are the seeds of true decolonization is valid. First, factually speaking, is a description of the ASS by anti-globalization activists and militants accurate? Second, could a coup d'etat be legitimate if it responded to popular aspirations? Given the long span of African history, what form might decolonization take next, whether through a coup d'etat or through constitutionally sanctioned mechanisms? First, is the ASS defensible? In his recent book, Africa versus Democracy, journalist Ousmane Diaye is particularly harsh on Aminata Dramane Traoré, to whom he addresses an open letter. According to him, intellectuals like Traoré and Boubacar Boris Diop are victims of what he called, and I quote, Western centrism in reverse, end of quote. Indeed, according to Ndiaye, in the work of Diop and Traoré, I quote, a subtle shift has occurred from the deconstruction of the neoliberal world order to the exclusive denunciation of the West, end of quote. The most serious aspect, according to Ndiaye, is that for these authors, the denunciation of France ultimately becomes a substitute for genuine thought, and Africa gradually disappears from their discourse and writings, becoming merely a backdrop to an obsessive critique of the former colonial power. In his view, this obsession, and I quote, this obsession overlooks complexities and nuances, sometimes to the point of simplifying reality into a binary view. This leads them, and I end of quote, this leads them to downplay internal responsibilities and focus the discourse on the West and France. Traoré defends the ASS in the name of the necessary economic dignity of African people. Ndiaye notes two things. First, this support benefits her personally. In her political stronghold, a democratically elected municipal council was dismissed by the junta and replaced by a team headed by Mrs. Traoré, whom the junta installed by force. Second, what gives Mrs. Traoré the legitimacy to decide on behalf of every other Malian that her ultimate aspiration, namely economic comfort for all, which she equates with dignity, is a more fundamental right than freedom. The ASS junta have entered into what could generously be described as a strategic alliance with Russia. Boukari Yabara and Simoa accept this alliance for the sake of anti-extractivism and anti-colonialism. One can accept such an interpretation. If so, one should also accept that the ECOWAS states have freely entered into a strategic alliance with France in the economic and military spheres. In what way is Russia less extractivist in France in Africa than France in Africa? Here again, the attempt coup in Benin is instructive. Another possible interpretation of this event is that it was an attempt by the ASS states, all three of which are enclaves, to secure access to the sea. How would this be any less colonial than controlled by France or a French company of the port of Abidjan? Control granted, moreover, by an elected political authority. Aminata Traoré, like many defenders of the ASS, claims that this organization is a unique opportunity to break free from colonialism that structure international economic relations and to ensure the economic dignity of African people. The ASS military themselves claim that their seizure of power is justified not only by the need to break free from French colonial rule, but also by the need to protect their state from jihadist attacks. Mali, for example, has not only expelled the French and Western contingents that were helping, and German, that were helping fight the jihadists, but has also expelled the African forces, notably those from Senegal, that had committed themselves to fighting alongside Mali. One can certainly accept that Senegal is a neo-colony. But 5 years later, where are we? Have the sovereign forces of the ASS succeeded in reducing the jihadists? Not really. On the contrary, these forces are now on the border of Senegal and are organizing a blockade of Bamako, preventing the arrival of imports from the port of Dakar. Where Aminata Dramane Traoré sees a renewed economic dignity, many prosaically only see long lines at gas stations and a fuel shortage so severe that the government had to close schools for 2 weeks. Unlike Mali, therefore, Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire, despite their new colonial character, seem capable of ensuring that their children have the dignity of taking the bus to school, while young Malians, however dignified they may be, remain at home. The Liptako Gourma Charter has been hailed by many as an effective and innovative alternative to security and economic dependence on France. The very concept of a charter is indeed reminiscent of the famous Monday Charter of the illustrious Sundiata Keita. However, a careful reading of the 17 articles of this charter shows that its concerns are exclusively security-related. The signatories of this charter are solely interested in the mutual protection of their power and mutual assistance in the event of aggression by a third country. Unlike the Monday Charter, therefore, the Liptako Gourma Charter does not organize a new civilization, nor promote harmonious coexistence based on mutual recognition and the management of differences. Even more seriously, while one of the reasons most often cited for France's continued hold over Africa is the CFA franc, none of the ASS countries have left this monetary zone. These states are challenging ECOWAS, the political body responsible for guiding governance, but remain members of WEMU and continue using the CFA franc, supposedly to the counter-revolutionary currency par excellence. Putting all of these elements together, it seems to me that it is simpler to use Occam's razor and conclude that West African juntas are not at all concerned with decolonization, but are using anti-French rhetoric to justify an illegal seizure of power, made possible by the genuinely democratic aspirations of the local populations. Senegalese philosopher Oumar Dia points out in one of his articles that Mitterrand's speech in La Baule was aimed more at controlling an inevitable democratization movement than at promoting democracy in Africa. The same is true of the ASS juntas. They are not so much seeking to free their countries from colonization as to enjoy power by riding on the wave of young Africans' desire for freedom. Could a coup d'etat ever be legitimate? Hegel summed up political realism in a striking aphorism. The will is rational and the rational is will. Without going that far, one might ask whether and when a coup d'etat could ever be legitimate. When a head of state uses the police to violently repress protesters, when he manipulates the constitution to remain in power, and when he transforms the judicial system into an instrument for blocking any potential change, is it not legitimate for the army to depose him? It seems to me that it would be idolizing the letter of the rule of law not to accept that in such cases, it is entirely legitimate for the army as the only organized force with the capacity to ask such a despot to intervene. It would be interesting here to take a detour via Hannah Arendt and her reflections on the nature of authority. Remember that, according to Arendt, authority should be the foundation of politics, but is often misunderstood. Authority is confused with either violence or persuasion. And indeed, in terms of their effects, these concepts are similar. They all enable obedience to be obtained. However, according to Arendt, this similarity is superficial. She considers that where there is coercion, there is no authority, but simply forced obedience. The use of force is a sure sign that authority has failed and that it is forced to rely on something external to itself. Similarly, Arendt believes that persuasion is also incompatible with authority. Persuasion presupposes equality between the parties to the conflict and the possibility that obedience may go one way or the other. Authority, on the other hand, is based on a hierarchy tacitly agreed upon by all parties, which guarantees the organization of society around norms and relationships accepted by all. The authority of the justice system, for example, should not come from its ability to use force, but from the existence of traditions of lawmaking and law enforcement, such that no one can seriously question the applicability of laws passed by Parliament. In this sense, contrary to what one might think, the less the police needs to enforce the law, the more authoritative the society is. In Arendt's sense, a police state is essentially a violent state, but this violence is not a guarantee of the strength of the state's authority. Rather, it is the surest sign of its absence. If we understand Arendt correctly, what is true for the justice system is also true for the army. The foundation of a democratic republic is the principle of civilian authority over the military. In a sense, the armed forces voluntarily submit to the elected political and constitutional power, accepting its order even when they deem them inept. The army is there to serve the objective defined by the state, the sole repository of political authority, not to serve its own ends. In a democracy, it is understood that the will of the states is the vox populi, insofar as the political apparatus that governs the state is the result of transparent and legitimate elections. As a result, its ultimate directives there is a clear chain of command within the military, and that is democratically controlled and takes its ultimate directive from the political authority. This implies a solid legal framework, a clear chain of command under democratic control, and the subordination of military decisions to political directives. This fundamental principle ensures that the armed force remain instruments of the state, respect the rule of law, and protect civilians on the Constitution relying on the Constitution to define their roles and limitations. It is helpful to keep this Arendtian framework in mind when reflecting upon the ambiguous role that Fanon assigns to the lumpen proletariat and his criticism of spontaneity in The Wretch of the Earth. Fanon asserts that while the urban lumpen proletariat is best placed to understand and initiate the decolonial struggle, It is also most likely to switch sides precisely because it is in such a dire straits that it is indifferent to which side of the struggle it allies itself with. Its only concern is to escape its miserable situation. This state of affairs is not the subject of moralizing consideration for Fanon. On the contrary, it is an opportunity to critically analyze spontaneity in the struggle for decolonization. For Fanon, the decolonial struggle, like any meaningful human action, presupposes politics. Politics is nothing more than an awareness of the complexity of reality and an understanding that solidarity, national consciousness, and the struggle for liberation are not natural but built. The lumpen proletariat only becomes a decolonial force after it has become politicized, or rather has been disciplined by a leadership that takes the trouble to work on building a genuine national consciousness. The problem is that this national consciousness itself can only emerge if the national bourgeoisie decides to commit what Amilcar Cabral would later call class suicide and put itself at the service of the entire population rather than its own class interest. The coup d'etat we have seen since the independence of Africa are merely the results of the failure to build a genuine national consciousness that places the interests of society as a whole above those of any particular group within it. They show those aspiring to lead and take power for themselves behaving, ironically, in Fanon's words, as the most indisciplined and politically irresponsible class in the country. When supporters of this coup speak in the name of Fanon and decolonization, then they demonstrate a profound misunderstanding of the complexity of Fanon's thinking and the subtlety of his analysis. While intellectuals and military leaders in West Africa often justify coups in the name of return to a fantasized authenticity, their own history, whether pre-colonial or not, contains documented mechanism for removing power from a leader who has become despotic. In this case, we could speak of a tradition of virtuous coup d'etat from which today's soldier could draw inspiration if they truly wanted to contribute to promoting a genuinely decolonized political life. A virtuous tradition of coup d'etats. I have stated that there is a tradition of what could be likened to virtuous coup d'etat, from which our soldiers should draw inspiration. Should is true song, I think. If they intend to carry out coup d'etats in the public interest. This is a good moment to recall one of the earliest definitions of coup d'etat, that of Gabriel Naudez, who defined it as bold and extraordinary actions that princes are compelled to perform in difficult and seemingly desperate situations, contrary to common law, without even maintaining any order or form of justice, risking the interest of the individual for the good of the public. Except for the word prince, one might think that one was reading a contemporary West African soldier explaining the imperative obligation he felt to interrupt the legitimate political process. In our modern conception of a coup d'etat, what is illuminating is a differentiation between coup d'etat and revolution. The latter completely overturns the socio-political order. The former sees certain actors in the socio-political order seizing the instrument of power to occupy a leadership position that is not legitimately theirs. If we now return to the history of West Africa, we can recognize that the political matrix of the region is the creation around 1235 of the Mali Empire and the establishment of the Mandé Charter, which still structures relations between social groups today. This question is interesting for several reasons. I'll focus on three aspects. When Mande society wanted to free itself from the yoke of the Soso, it turned to a marginalized but legitimate prince to lead the revolution. Immediately after the revolution, society as a whole came together to define the values which it wanted to be based upon, the mechanism for coexistence between different groups that made up society, and the mechanism for devolution of power. When the fourth emperor of Mande, Mansa Khalifa, proved incompetent and tyrannical, the Mande establishment organized to remove him from power and replace him with a legitimate prince, Mansa Abubakar. This motif of the tyrannical and incompetent prince recurs frequently in West African history. Thus, when 5 centuries after the Mande, a group of Muslim soldier monks led by Thierno Souleymane Baal overthrew a slave trafficking regime in the Fouta to create in 1776 an anti-slavery Islamic theocracy, these revolutionaries rejected the monarchical devolution of power and devised instead a mechanism for electing the Almami, who was to be chosen from among the scholars by a separate group of grand electors who were not eligible for election themselves. To ensure the sustainability of this organization, Thierno Souleymane Baal enacted a set of best practices, the most important of which was to remove from office and confiscate the property of any elected Almami who took advantage of his position to enrich himself. The last example I will give comes from another Senegalese kingdom, the Kingdom of Kayor. This kingdom had also an institutional organization in which the princes and the elector were not the same. Each family line, often matrilineal, had a specialty and occupied some positions in the state by right. But the choice of who would occupy a particular position was always a choice among those eligible of who was deemed the most competent. A superficial reading of the Senegambian kingdoms sees them as monarchies that were all the more rigid because they were interconnected by family ties. However, the treatment of tyrants shows that there was still a genuine legitimation of coups d'etats, provided they were justified by the general interest. This is what happened with the overthrow of Dezember Kulifal, the sixth Damel of Kayor. The latter's reign lasted only 7 years, from 1640 to 1647, before he was deposed and exiled. What strikes us in the Wolof oral tradition about this unfortunate reign is that at the time of his election to replace his brother, the question of his moral suitability for such a position was raised by the kingdom's elector. It was his comrade, the philosopher and no less important elector, Koch Barmafal, who convinced the Electoral College to let him reign. Once installed, Dezember proved to be tyrannical beyond measure, reinstating the droit du seigneur, surrounding himself of a militia of young men, relegating the elders and electors to the background, and pushing his hubris to the point of forbidding the common people from yawning and stretching, because everything pleasant should be the privilege of the king and his entourage. It was only after a series of assassinations though, that he was removed from office. And this overthrow was achieved not only by securing the support of the armed forces, but also by building a broad consensus among the electors to give the Damel the choice between retiring between retiring and or being forcefully removed. The perpetrators of this coup made sure, above all, to consensually choose the person best suited to replace him from the ruling line. In this case, his nephew, Major. The same philosopher, Koch Barma, who had convinced the electorate to make Dezember king, was responsible for informing him of his dismissal. Philosophers can be useful sometimes. What conclusions can we draw from all these developments? Let's start with what we have just described, namely the existence of a tradition of virtuous coup in pre-colonial Africa. We cannot simply confine ourselves to a position of principle that no coup is ever legitimate. It is sometimes necessary to remove power from a leader who has become tyrannical. This is a possibility that seems to have always been part of West African political thought and practice. One might therefore think that the coup d'etat we are currently witnessing are nothing more than a distant continuation of these traditions. What is striking, however, about the tradition I have described is two things that we rarely found in today's coup. On the one hand, the takeover of power is always the result of building the broadest possible consensus among the actors. On the other hand, those who organize the coup do not retain power for themselves, but return it to the person to whom it would have been fallen under normal circumstances. The institutional disruption is therefore minimal. Here we can distinguish between self-serving and legitimate coup. Self-serving coup benefit their perpetrators. Legitimate coups are truly restorative, being intended to justify to protect the general interest. On a more theoretical level, we have seen that the Fanonian justification for this coup is a result of a misreading of this author, one that does not take into account the full complexity of Fanon's thinking. Are we currently experiencing a decolonial moment in West Africa with a series of decolonial coups? I don't think so. Those who claim this are either profiting financially from it or are the useful idiots of a Russian imperialist offensive that is all the more dangerous because it adorns itself with the trappings of decoloniality to pursue an agenda that is even more extractivist and colonial than that of the Western powers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for your rich talk and for this very complex picture, especially concerning West Africa. Probably I should repeat some of the main players. You mentioned the economic organization of Western African states, which is in a certain way an arm of European economic organizations. We have the three Sahel states which try to form a sort of opposition against these economic organizations. We have the jihadists, and we have the penetrating of Russian power in this region. And this means it's a very complex field of forces in which the question of finally the coup d'etat is at stake. And at the last part of your talk, you mentioned a very old tradition in Africa, going back to the medieval ages, to show a completely different kind of coup d'etat, which cannot really be grasped and described by or with Western concepts. Against this background, and also against this background of a very virtuous tradition in Africa, would you say that we have to reflect the coup d'etat in European Western terms as a sort of indistinction between coup d'etat and revolution, for example? So is there a certain zone of indistinction between revolutionary forces on the one hand and the coup d'etat on the other hand?
Thank you for this very interesting question. And may I ask you a question beforehand? Yeah. You said twice that ECOWAS is the arm of the Western economic organizations.
I think so.
Why?
Because it was a sort of successor of the old West African French colonies, first. Second, it's an organization which has strong economic ties to France. And third, it's also linked to the currency of this region, which is also linked, for example, to central bank in France.
Yeah, but if you look at ECOWAS, you have countries that has the CFA franc, yeah, and countries that don't, yeah, and they are trying to create a space that looks like the European Union, whereas you have criteria of convergence, economic criteria of convergence, the idea being that they need to have an economic space and enlarge the adoption of a local currency. They have relations with Europe. They also have relations with Russia and all these countries. I think it's problematic to consider that countries that have chosen to organize themselves in this way are automatically subordinate. You see, for example.
Probably I didn't. So let me be prudent.
That's something that people say,
yeah,
and everyone considers that it's normal and natural. I think things are more complex than that. That's my point. So
I just wanted to.
Also, it's a trapping because if we accept that, yeah, it legitimizes also other discourses, some other discourses.
You are completely right. I just wanted to underline the conflict between the Sahel states on the one hand and this economic organization, because one reason to quit the economic organization was exactly this, I would say, presupposition that this is an arm of France's colonial politics.
Yeah, of course. Where I will agree with the critics is that ECOWAS is essentially a neoliberal organization, which is we can be neoliberal too. So that's a problem for me, but still, we can be stupid too. Now, about the indistinction between coup d'etats and revolution, it seems to me that in Africa, in traditional Africa, and also in the modern political theory, you have this distinction between revolutions and coup d'etats. For example, if you take the Mali Empire, it began because you had the Soso Empire that Mali was part of, and at some point these people wanted to be free. So they considered that the Soso was being despotic and Sundiata Keita, they had a real revolution, and the first thing they did after the revolution was to to go at a place which is Kurukan Fuga in Guinea, and they decided which society they wanted to build. A life is a life. You have all these the charter of Kurukan Fuga, which is very beautiful actually, and is mostly egalitarian. Women are not, but mostly there are very beautiful ideas in this charter. This is a revolution. And actually, if you look at the framework that has been put forward at this time, it still organizes the relations between different ethnic groups in West Africa. If you take the case of Dezember Khulifal, Dezember is one of the legitimate heirs. And at the moment of choosing the king, he should have been king if he were morally sound. And people told Koch Barma, who is supposed to be the first Senegalese philosopher, told him this guy can't be because he's tyrannical, and Koch Barma were like, we should elect him anyway because he is legitimate and he's the oldest and all this stuff. When he became tyrannical, they decided to remove him. That to me is a coup. But also there is this consensus that has been sought after, so that once the coup is effective, they would have someone who is a legitimate heir and who is morally should have been elected. It's the same, it seems to me, when Thierno Suleiman Bal says that if you should elect the best, the most moral man. But if he becomes rich, it means that you have not chosen the good one. So so you should remove him from power. And to me, this is a coup d'etat. What makes the legitimacy of the coup d'etat, to me, one factor that could excuse it is the fact that, for example, you have minimal disruption. You remove someone, you organize elections, you leave. For example, someone who did it in Mali is Amadou Toumani Touré. When Moussa Traoré killed, when there is this revolution in Mali and Moussa Traoré didn't want to leave, Amadou Toumani Touré, who was at the time at the head of the army, decided to remove him. When he removed him, he organized elections, and he weren't candidate to these elections. So he organized a new constitution, organized the politics they wanted, and all this stuff, and then he left. He left the army, and then I think 10 years or 20 years later, or 15 years later, he became president, elected president. To me, this guy organized a coup d'etat that should be considered legitimate.
So there's a very interesting notion you used in your talk. I think it came from Eurodia, the Sisypheal democracy. Yeah. Also die Sisyphus der Demokratie. Can you explain what is it? Because for me it seems to be very special for Africa.
Yeah. And that's a problem. I mean, ECOWAS, you have legitimate criticism of ECOWAS. One of them is that ECOWAS is very tolerant of what the presidents in exercise do. And now we have a rule saying that 6 months before the election, you should not change the rules. But what used to happen, and happened in Côte d'Ivoire, for example, is that you will have someone who is elected in a constitution that says that you have only 2 terms, and then who decides that you need to change constitutions. And then given that we change constitution, for example, Senegal, the president of Senegal tried that two presidents of Senegal tried that. And given that we changed constitution, there is no retroactivity of the constitution. So even though it is two-term, my first term doesn't apply. So I have right to go for election for the third term. Abdoulaye Wade tried it and lost. Macky Sall said that he had a right to be candidate for 2024, and when he understood that he couldn't win, well, that's one way of reading it. When he understood that he couldn't win, he didn't go to the elections. He decided that I could have, but I decided not to. So you have these manipulations of constitutions frequently. And it's one of the limits of democracy, because when you have the majorities and and when the justice system, for example, does not stop you, you can do whatever you want and do it legally. And that, to me, is a very problem. I don't know whether I responded to your question.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Thank you.
I see the faces of the public, and I think the answer was correct. Are there already questions from the public? If not, we can filibuster here some more questions and answers. I have for me, a very important question, which I think is important also to understand your perspective on coup d'etat. You say that the apology of the decolonizing character of the coup d'etat is a Western centrism in reverse. A Western centrism in reverse. So how to escape this trap? How to escape this Western centrism in reverse, or this dead end?
Yes. One of the very problematic people, and it pains me to say it because I like him very much. He's our best writer. It's Boubacar Bohis Diop. You should read him. He's a very, very good writer. He is, for example, he's an apologist of Kagame's. You know, I don't know whether you know Kagame. Everyone knows Kagame, but Kagame is the president of Rwanda. He's been president since the genocide. And to give you an idea of who he is, at some point, people got killed in South Africa. People who criticized him got killed in South Africa. Then he went to South Africa, and people asked him, it's not nice to kill people, you know. And he was, everyone was like, yeah, we didn't do it and all this stuff. And he came to South Africa and he said something. He said, if people want to destabilize our country, they will die. That's what he said. And 2 years ago, a singer, one very prominent singer, criticized him and tried to leave the country by foot and got killed. A singer, really not someone prominent. He was a singer, you know. So he criticized him and tried to leave, and he got killed before leaving Rwanda. So that's Kagame. But Kagame has this anti-France stance, even though he's very pro-Western and pro-US. And people like Boubacar Bohis Diop will say that Kagame is someone we should support because he's anti-France. What's the point? You see that people like that, their thinking is someone who is anti-France is necessarily good. And that's what happened in Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso. You have people seizing power. And once they seize power, they say, okay, we need to remove France. France is is colonizing us and blah, blah, blah. And everyone is saying, given that they are anti-France, they are the only one who can free us from France, so they are good. What's the point? If you say that politics is here to help people solve their problems, for example, For Mali, the military said that they were here because of the jihadis, and they called on the Russian to help them. They do not even fight the jihadis, and they can't manage something as simple as having fuel in the country. So that's a problem to me. So it doesn't mean that France is not extractivist. It seems to me that at least, what I see at least is that in Senegal, my kids are going to school. So, and to me, that is something important.
Yeah, I wanted to refer to some of your writings in which you ask the same question. In which respect a certain critique of Eurocentrism can be Eurocentrism in reverse. And you have this very interesting concept of creolizing political theory, also die Kreolisierung der politischen Theorie. And you mentioned, for example, that Augustinus, one of the founder of scholastic philosophy or theology, is North African. And that if you look at Machiavelli, you have a lot of strange influences. Yeah. And for me was this attempt to not to reverse Eurocentrism, but to creolize Eurocentrism or political philosophy of Western world, one of the most interesting aspects of your articles.
Thank you. The idea of creolization also is something that comes in political theory. The one who prominently introduced it is Jane Anna Gordon from University of Connecticut. Michael Monahan also, but it comes also from Glissant, but also from works on linguistics by someone who is at the University of Chicago. Saliloko Mufweke, I think. Salikoko Mufweke. He's at the University of Chicago at the linguistics department. The idea of creolizing introduced here is the idea that there is no purity in our political systems. If we look at, for example, Europeans, one problem we have is that most people will say democracy is a result, for example, of the Enlightenment, and that the Enlightenment is a purely European phenomenon. So, if you want democracy for yourself, it means that you are brainwashed. And for example, a lot of people, for example, someone like Mobutu, for example, invested a lot in soi-disant African philosophy, and the idea was that African philosophy is an authoritarian philosophy of power. First, Africa is the most diverse place in the world. If you look at, for example, languages, Senegal has 18 million people and has 20 languages. You have countries that have like 200, 400 languages in one country. If you look at political systems, there has been a lot of political systems. And if you look at, for example, democracy in Europe, if you look at the history of political philosophy in Europe, I don't think there is a single concept that you wouldn't trace back to something external to Europe. And to me, it's the same with every concept you take. If you go outside Europe with a concept, you say, okay, this comes from here. You go there, you will trace it back to another area. And then if you come to Africa's concepts, African concepts also, they will be traceable either outside Africa or inside Africa. If you look at what happened, for example, in the Cayor, when you have, okay, this line, these are the one who should be king. These are the one who should be minister of land landowners or guardians of the land. These should be, etc., etc. You had all this, and then you had to choose a king. You have a commission that should choose, that would be composed of X, Y, Z, and that choose between those who are eligible, who can be king. To me, that's almost as democratic as it gets, or it is a democratic system. So if someone says that Africa is democratic, is not democratic, this is a problem, because there is no one way to be African. And in the history of Africa, there are a lot of influences, and this is normal. And in the history of philosophy, in all disciplines, it is normal that there are influences. And the problem now with Eurocentrism in reverse, you are right, I didn't respond to your question. It comes from Ousmane Ndiaye, who is a journalist living in Paris. And he's right. People like Boubacar Boris Diop, Aminata Traoré, etc. If you see what they are saying, let's say we need to be free from France. Okay. We need to be free from France. Do you need to elect your leaders? It begins at home. I mean, Aminata Traoré lives in a neighborhood in Bamako, which is great. In this neighborhood, she went to election, she lost. Happens. And then the junta decided that those who won should be removed, and that she should be placed there as head of the neighborhood. Why shouldn't people in her neighborhood choose who leads them? If you say that you want an empowering politics, it begins at home. Why shouldn't these people, I mean, it's illegitimate to take power this way, but collaborating with the junta, the only reason she says she collaborates with the junta is that she considers that the junta is the only way to free us from France and from Europe. And actually, it frees them from Europe by introducing the Russians, who, as far as I know, are Europeans. So, what's the point? To me, these people, I don't know whether it's conscious or not, but the hatred of France can justify anything, which is problematic. The second problematic thing is that it profits them. Like, Aminata Traoré, she travels to Europe, and she's a member of some groups of organization where she comes and talks about altermondialization, the economic system, the problem with the economic system, and all this stuff. She gets paid to do that. She gets to go back to Bamako and to lead a neighborhood and to do business there, in a moment where you have a junta at the head of the country. To me, this is morally problematic, and that's something Ousmane Ndiaye published a book this year, 2025, about the problems of democracy in Africa, about democracy in Africa. The title is L'Afrique contre la démocratie, and it's about these compromisions of the elite, supposedly that's supposedly wants democracy, but only if it profits them.
Yeah, thank you so much. Once more, I still have questions, but probably there are questions from the public. Please raise your hands or whatever leg you want to raise it to. Yeah, here.
Hello. Thank you very much. Actually, very interesting. You said about the Constitution, right? So that the governments, presidents change the Constitution to zero out their terms, nullify and become again a president, or reset and so for two terms, again be a president, right? And seems like the world accepts it as normal. It's okay for them, right? Although for those who live in these countries feel that it's not fair, especially the other parties, right? And then, of course, we know that the democracy is kind of very vague. What do you think? Is it possible to have the decision, the law adopted by the United Nations to prohibit the constitutional reforms that allow the current acting presidents to stay forever or at least more time? What do you think?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question, and it happened twice in Senegal. The former president Abdoulaye Wade tried. I mean, he decided that given that there had been a constitutional reform, blah blah blah, he was now eligible, and he went to election and he lost. Before elections, there had been a lot of demonstration problems, and he lost. His successor, who should have known better, also decided that given that there had been a change in the constitution, etc., he had the right to be candidate to the next election, after his second term. There were so many demonstrations and problems that by the end he said something to the effect, I have the right to be candidate, but I decided not to be candidate. I generously decided not to be candidate. Then he did a lot of stuff, but he still left. This is the case of Senegal. Senegal has a history of a very rich political life and mostly democratic, let's say. Well, political life, and people protest, and you have the French tradition of protesting, and which is very good, and burning stuff and all this stuff, Other countries have other tradition. For example, in Mali, the military will intervene. Senegalese military won't intervene in this stuff. They will just keep quiet and let the police do the work and wait for the justice system to take decisions. And the justice system in Senegal were mostly exemplary in 2024. So to me, this is politics. I mean, politics is not necessarily happy, because you don't necessarily have happy endings. Sometimes you have happy endings, sometimes not. In Côte d'Ivoire, for example, Ouattara managed to have a fourth term. In Senegal, no one managed to do that. So these countries are, and the coup d'etats also are part of the politics, I think. But I don't think there should be external meddling. For example, the ECOWAS itself decided that you cannot change the rules of the game 6 months. I think it's 6 months before. I'm not a lawyer, so 6 months before you cannot change the rules of the game. And I mean, there is people are pushing for it to be normalized, for the political life to be normalized, to be legal, to have the rule of law, etc. This is something that people do on the ground, and those who are on the ground, to me, are the only people who can do it. I think the Senegalese citizenry, for example, is the only one who is legitimate to meddle in what's happening. And if people want to help, for example, foreigners want to help, I would be glad if they decided to impose sanction of the families of someone who decided XYZ, but I don't want them to meddle in what's happening at our place. That's my position.
So there are two more questions, please. Ethel Matala and yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for your rich and also puzzling account of the situation in Françafrique. My question goes back to your description of the case of Benin, and I would like to ask you if you could expand a little bit on the role of the bourgeoisie. Because on the one hand, you mentioned that there are people, the businessmen that you described, who still take advantage or benefit from their good relationships to French enterprises, right? And if this is the case, so if this is the class that doesn't support this anti-French hatred, how is it possible that a representative of this class can be elected? This doesn't seem plausible to me. And can you explain it how?
I'm not sure. I don't know how, for example, it is possible that you have a system in which the American governments finance researches and finance universities, and then the research gets hoarded by a group of people who create businesses that are financed by the American governments, and then they become billionaires, and when they become billionaires, they can elect a president, and when they elect the president, they can do whatever they want. That's politics. It's, I mean, the case, I wasn't happy, but still, when the coup d'etat arrived in Benin, I was like, this is God-given for my talk. I mean, Patrice Talon is so paradoxical because he's a legitimate businessman, because it's a guy who wanted to be a pilot. And he couldn't be a pilot because he had an illness, so he decided to go into business. He's from a businessman's family, so he got very rich in the cotton business. And at some point, Bruce Springsteen says something, has this verse, poor man wanna be rich, rich man wanna be king. Patrice Talon, at some point, he got elected his friend, Yahi Boni, because, you know, he was too busy to be president, so he got his friend elected. And at some point, I think the country owed him money. So he asked to be paid back. They didn't pay him back. And okay, I'll take a partial version of the story. The story goes, he tries to kill the president with the help of I don't know whether if it was her cousin, the cousin of the president, a woman who cooked for the president and who was like, I don't know, her niece or something. So he tried to kill the president. It didn't work. He left for France. He managed to get pardoned by the president. He was in France. He got pardoned. He came back. He got elected for 2 terms. And I was sure that he wouldn't leave. He decided that, one of the first things he did when he became president was ask the country, take his money back from the country. Like what he considers the country owed him, he paid himself. He paid himself. And then he did his 2 terms, and everyone says that, I've never been to Benin, but people say that he's been a very efficient president. And then he decided that he wouldn't seek a third term. In April, there is an election. There is someone he wants to get elected, but we do not know whether the guy will be elected or not. Probably yes, because he's competent and efficient and all this. But still, he decided that he won't seek a third term. to me, that's how politics work. The elite everywhere has always been horrible. That's the case here. That's the case in France. That's the case in the US. That's the case in Africa. And people always, there is always a force, rapport de force. Power relations between the population, the elite, etc. And most of the time the elite wins, but sometimes the time we win, we the people, and we advance our agenda. But that's how politics work. So I don't. To me, what would be puzzling is if it was the contrary. If it was the contrary, there has been a study that showed that, I think in Italy, it was in Florence or somewhere, the families that were prominent during the Quattrocento or something are still prominent. I mean, it's the same in Senegal. I suppose it's the same if we trace it. Senegal is more mobile, still, but still. I'm sorry, this is very cynical, but...
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm curious about this distinction or portrayal of coups as revolutions, and you mentioned that earlier as well. So in the 70s and 80s, in many Anglophone countries, there was for some time very popular in legal doctrine to use Hans Kelsen and his theory of revolution to justify military coups. So I would be very curious if this argument of Kelsen, who basically said a coup is a revolution if it's effective, if it's lasting. So quite the opposite of what you said. But to what extent this is also floating around or maybe revitalized in the Francophone discourse today?
I would have loved if our coups were revolutions. But I consider that a coup is not a revolution only if it succeeds. A coup is a revolution if it changes the structures of power, not only succession. To me, I couldn't dwell more on Fanon's critique of spontaneity. But the Fanon's critique of spontaneity is very interesting because he says that we need politics in order to change the country. So, and if you put together Fanon and Gramsci, it seems to me it becomes very interesting because you need to build a new way of seeing, etc., in order to have something effective. And the coups, to me, are more like most coups in Africa are more like what Fanon calls spontaneity, because it's just a group of people who decide that they can seize power because it advances their interest. And Fanon shows that in a colonial situation, decolonization doesn't happen when just because you revolt. It happens when revolts is transformed into political movement that tries to change the way not only the forces but also the way we think politically of the situation. Does it respond to your question, or do you want me to? You seem perplexed. Yeah.
Maybe just to follow up. I mean, you earlier said you're not a lawyer, so I am a lawyer. So what I meant is, I know that in like in Nigeria, Uganda, also in Ghana, in the 60s to 80s, Kelsen was used in the courtroom to justify military regimes. So I was wondering if this is now also happening in some of the Francophone military regimes today. I mean, maybe not in the courtroom because another colonial legacy.
They are not cultured enough. I'm sorry. That's,
maybe among philosophers.
no, I haven't. I haven't listened. I haven't. Frankly, the level of the discussion right now is France is bad, and you are a sellout to France. So it doesn't go. And quoting one or two quotes of Fanon about violence or stuff, but nothing else, nothing more. For example, even the critique of spontaneity that I propose today, I've never heard anyone use it for or against the coups. So I really don't think. For example, the Charter of Liptako Goma, I was very curious to read it because I thought it would be interesting. And no, it's just about keeping power. I'm sorry.
Thank you so much for this answers. I remember that I think it was the December 1st, one of the most famous German news magazines, Der Spiegel, had a headline which is cited as follows: "Why are there so many coups d'etat in Africa?" And I think your talk and your answers gave us some perspectives to answer these questions, and probably also with a letter to the Spiegel. And thank you so much for your presentation, for your answers. And please remind that January 22nd, we have the next Mosse-Lecture with Kim Shepperly from Princeton University. The title is Counter-Constitution. And I think this talk will address directly the situation in United States in the Le Monde. Once more, thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Hedy, for having me. It was an honor.